There is a room in Jerusalem built to look like the lid of a clay jar. Inside it, under low light and controlled air, lies a strip of animal skin about 7 meters long, 17 sheets, stitched end to end. 54 columns of Hebrew written in dark ink by a hand that has been dead for over 2,000 years. Look closely at the surface. You can see the ruled lines the scribe scored into the leather before he began. You can see where the stitching pulled. You can see corrections squeezed between the lines, and words added above them, because even this scribe made mistakes and went back to fix them. There are no chapter numbers, no verse numbers, no vowel marks, just consonants, pressed tight, column after column, the way Hebrew was written before any of those systems existed. This object should not have survived. Leather rots, ink fades, cities burn. In the 2,000 years since this scroll was written, the land it came from was conquered, emptied, rebuilt, and conquered again. Almost every document from that world is gone. This one is not gone. And somewhere in its final columns, near the end, where the hand has grown a little more hurried, there is a passage that Christians have read for 2,000 years as a description of the death of Jesus. Isaiah 53. Written down, copied, rolled up, and hidden in a cave in the Judean desert, before Jesus of Nazareth was born. Sit with that for a moment, because it creates a question that most people never think to ask. How can a text used to describe the crucifixion already exist, in Hebrew, on animal skin, generations before the crucifixion happened? That is what we are going to investigate, not as a sermon, as an artifact. We are going to ask what this manuscript can actually prove, what it cannot prove, and what scholars, Jewish and Christian, believing and skeptical, genuinely conclude when they examine it. If you find investigations like this worth your time, subscribe. This channel is built for people who want the evidence, not just the conclusion. Now let's go back to the desert. The Dead Sea sits at the lowest point on the surface of the earth. Around it, cliffs of pale limestone rise out of the salt flats, cracked and hollow, riddled with caves. Almost nothing lives there. The air is dry enough to preserve rope, cloth, and skin for centuries. In the winter of 1946 into 1947, Bedouin shepherds from the Qumran tribe were moving their animals along those cliffs, about a mile inland from the shore, near a ruin the locals called Qumran. The story that has come down to us, and it is a story that has been retold many times, with details that shift depending on who tells it, is that a young shepherd named Muhammad ed-Dib threw a stone into a cave opening while looking for a lost animal. He heard pottery break. That detail is worth pausing on. A stone thrown into a dark hole should hit rock. It hit clay. Inside the cave were tall cylindrical jars, some still with their lids in place. Most were empty, but not all of them. Wrapped in linen, inside one of them were scrolls. The shepherds had no way to know what they were holding. The material was brittle and dark, wrapped tight, smelling of old leather. Some pieces crumbled. The scrolls were carried out, passed between hands, and eventually offered for sale in Bethlehem, where they sat for months among people who had no idea of their value. 7 scrolls came out of that first cave. One of them was longer and better preserved than the rest. When it was finally unrolled, the text was legible almost from beginning to end. It was the book of Isaiah, all 66 chapters, complete. Today we call it the Great Isaiah Scroll. Over the next decade, searching became competitive. Bedouin and archaeologists worked the same cliffs, sometimes racing each other. 11 caves eventually yielded material. In total, the fragments of roughly 900 separate manuscripts were recovered, most of them not whole scrolls but pieces. Thousands of pieces. Some no larger than a fingernail. Among them were copies of nearly every book of the Hebrew Bible. Some books appeared many times over. Isaiah was one of the most heavily copied, alongside Psalms and Deuteronomy. Around 20 separate copies of Isaiah were identified at Qumran. Somebody in that community read Isaiah constantly. And then, at some point in the 1st century, the scrolls went into the caves and stayed there. The settlement at Qumran was destroyed during the Jewish revolt against Rome, around the year 68. Whether the scrolls were hidden deliberately as the Roman legions advanced or stored there over a longer period is still debated by archaeologists. The evidence supports more than one reconstruction. What is not debated is the outcome. The jars were sealed. The desert did the rest. Now here is the question that turned a regional archaeological curiosity into one of the most important discoveries of the 20th century. How old is it? Manuscripts are dated in two main ways, and both were used here. The first is paleography, the study of handwriting. Letter shapes change over time, the way handwriting styles change across generations. Scribes in 1 century form a letter with a particular stroke. 100 years later, that stroke has shifted. When you have enough dated samples, you can place an undated hand within a range. The second is radiocarbon dating, which measures carbon decay in the organic material itself, in this case, the animal skin. The Great Isaiah Scroll has been examined by both methods in separate tests, decades apart. Paleographers placed the handwriting in the 2nd century before Christ, with most estimates clustering around 125 BC. Radiocarbon testing in the 1990s produced date ranges that overlap that estimate, generally landing somewhere between the 3rd and 1st centuries before Christ. The two methods are independent of each other. They agree. So let's put that on a timeline, because the shape of it matters more than the numbers. The prophet Isaiah is placed in the 8th century before Christ. Jerusalem under threat from Assyria, kings and sieges. Then centuries pass. Exile, Babylon, return, Persian rule, Greek rule. Around 125 BC, a scribe sits down with prepared animal skin and copies the entire book of Isaiah. He is not copying it for us, he is copying it for his own community, for people who will read it aloud and study it. Then more time passes, about a century. And then Jesus of Nazareth is born. Then the Gospels are written in Greek, decades after the crucifixion. Then Christianity spreads through the Roman world. Look at the order. The scroll comes first, not by a year or two, by roughly 100 years before Jesus is born, and by nearly 200 years before the New Testament exists in the form we have it. Now, why does this matter so much to historians? Because of what came before the discovery. Until 1947, the oldest complete Hebrew manuscripts of the Bible available to scholars came from the medieval period, the Aleppo Codex from around the 10th century, the Leningrad Codex from the early 11th. Careful, beautiful, meticulously produced books, but roughly 1,000 years younger than the world of Qumran. That was the problem, a 1,000-year gap with almost nothing in it. And 1,000 years of hand copying is a long time for a text to drift. Which brings us to the second question, and this one is harder than the first. Knowing the manuscript is older than Jesus is interesting, but it only matters if the text inside it is the same text. So, is the Isaiah 53 in that scroll the Isaiah 53 we read today? To answer that honestly, you have to understand what copying actually involved. Every ancient book existed only as long as someone was willing to reproduce it by hand. A scribe worked from an existing copy, letter by letter, column by column, for weeks or months. And human beings make mistakes. A scribe's eye skips from one word to a similar word further down and drops the line between them. He hears a word wrong if the text is being dictated. He writes a familiar spelling instead of an older one. He corrects what he thinks is an error and introduces a new one. These are called textual variants. Scholars have cataloged them for centuries. They exist in every ancient text ever copied by hand: Homer, Plato, Roman histories, and the Bible. So when scholars compared the Great Isaiah Scroll to the medieval Hebrew text, they were not asking whether there would be differences. They knew there would be. They were asking what kind. Here is where the investigation gets specific. The comparison was made against the Masoretic text, the traditional Hebrew text preserved by Jewish scribes called the Masoretes, whose work produced those medieval codices. It had been the standard Hebrew Bible for a millennium, and when the two were laid side by side, the result was this. The Great Isaiah Scroll and the medieval Hebrew Isaiah are recognizably, substantially the same book. Same chapters, same structure, same content, same oracles, in the same order. The differences are real, and scholars counted them carefully. Most fall into predictable categories. Spelling. The Qumran scribe frequently uses a fuller spelling style, adding letters that function like vowel markers, the way you might write color instead of color. It changes the letters on the page. It does not change the word. Grammar and word forms, slightly different endings. different pronoun forms. Small word differences. Occasionally, a word appears in one and not the other, or a phrase is arranged differently. And a smaller number of genuinely meaningful variants, where the two texts say something measurably different, which we will look at directly, because one of them lands in Isaiah 53 itself. What the comparison established was not that the text was frozen, it was that the text was stable. Across roughly 1,000 years of hand copying, the book of Isaiah remained the book of Isaiah, with variation concentrated in spelling and form rather than substance. That is not a devotional claim. That is a manuscript conclusion, published and debated in academic literature since the 1950s and accepted across religious and secular scholarship alike. Which means we can now do something people could not do before 1947. We can open the ancient scroll to Isaiah 53 and read it for ourselves. In the scroll, there are no chapter divisions. Those were added by editors more than 1,000 years later. So a scribe at Qumran would not have said Isaiah 53. He would simply have kept reading. The passage begins in the middle of column 44 and runs into column 45. And there is something unusual about that spot on the leather. The scroll shows heavy wear near the columns containing this section. Repairs, stitching, places where the material has been handled until it thinned. That is not proof of anything by itself. Wear can come from many causes, and scholars are cautious about reading intention into damage. But it is a physical trace of use. Somebody unrolled to this part of the scroll, more than once. Now look at the text. The Hebrew runs right to left, letters hanging from an invisible line, no spaces between sentences the way we use them, no punctuation. The scribe's hand here is slightly cramped. In places he has written a word above the line, squeezed in, because he left it out and caught himself. That correction is one of the most human things in the entire manuscript. Someone was there. Someone was concentrating. Someone made an error and fixed it, and we can still see where. So what does the passage say? It describes a figure referred to as a servant, and the description is strange because it is the opposite of how ancient literature normally describes a hero. Here are the features that matter most. First, he is rejected. The text says he had no form or majesty that would attract people to him, that he was despised, that people turned their faces away from him, that he was not valued. Ancient texts glorify their subjects. Kings are tall, radiant, victorious. This one is not. The passage insists on his ordinariness and his humiliation. Second, he suffers on behalf of others. This is the theological center of the chapter, and it is repeated in several forms. The wounds are not described as deserved. The text says he was pierced because of the transgressions of others, that punishment fell on him so that others could have peace, and one of the most quoted lines in the Hebrew Bible, that by his wounds healing came. The logic is substitution. One suffers, others benefit. Third, he is silent. The text compares him to a sheep led to slaughter, and to a sheep before its shearers, which does not open its mouth. He does not protest. He does not defend himself. And fourth, he dies, and he is buried. The passage speaks of him being cut off from the land of the living. It mentions a grave, and a strange pairing, his grave assigned with the wicked and with a rich man in his death. Then, after death, the text does something unexpected. It speaks of him seeing light, of being satisfied, of prolonged days, of a portion given to him. And here is one of the genuinely meaningful variants I mentioned earlier. In that line about seeing light after his suffering, the medieval Hebrew text reads simply that he will see and be satisfied. The great Isaiah scroll includes the word light, he shall see light. So does the ancient Greek translation, made independently, centuries before the scroll was found. That is not a scandal. It is exactly the kind of small variant that textual scholars expect, and it shows the process working. Two ancient witnesses agreeing against a later one, letting scholars reconstruct with more confidence rather than less. If you're finding this valuable, a like and a comment genuinely helps the channel reach other people who want history handled carefully. And I read them. Now, the objection. Because at this point, someone reasonable and thoughtful raises a hand and says, fine, the manuscript is old, granted, but so what? An ancient text describing an anonymous suffering figure does not automatically mean the text is about Jesus. That objection is fair, and it deserves to be answered honestly rather than dismissed. Here is what the manuscript establishes, and here is what it does not. What it establishes: the text of Isaiah 53, in substantially the form we read today, existed in Hebrew before Jesus of Nazareth was born. That is a dated, physical, verifiable fact. It removes the possibility that Christians composed this passage after the crucifixion and inserted it into the Hebrew Bible. What it does not establish: who the passage was originally about or what it means. Those are separate questions, and they have been debated for 2,000 years, not because anyone is hiding anything, but because the passage itself does not name its subject. Jewish interpretation has long included a collective reading, in which the servant represents Israel, the nation suffering among the other nations. That reading has real support in the surrounding chapters of Isaiah, where the servant is explicitly identified as Israel more than once. It is a serious interpretation held by serious scholars. Other interpreters, ancient and modern, have read the servant as an individual figure. Some rabbinic sources across history applied servant language to a messianic figure. The interpretive history on both sides is genuinely complicated, and anyone who tells you it is simple is selling something. So the manuscript does not settle interpretation. It never could. What it does is clear the ground. It removes one specific accusation: the accusation of forgery, permanently and physically. The gospel accounts describe Jesus standing before both religious and Roman authorities and largely refusing to answer the charges against him. Mark and Matthew both record that Pilate was struck by it, that the silence itself was what surprised the governor. Why do Christians see a connection? Because silence under accusation is not the natural behavior of an innocent man. Innocent men argue. The convergence between a description written before and an account written after is what draws attention. The honest note: the gospel writers knew Isaiah. Some scholars argue the narratives were shaped by that knowledge, that the language of Isaiah influenced how the story was told. That is a real scholarly position, and it cannot be waved away. What it cannot explain is the existence of the description itself, which the scroll dates before the events entirely. Point 2. The manner of death and the grave. Isaiah 53 says the servant was cut off from the land of the living and pairs his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death. That pairing is odd. In the ancient world, an executed criminal and a wealthy man do not share a burial. The gospel accounts describe Jesus executed between two criminals and then buried in a new tomb belonging to Joseph of Arimathea, described as a wealthy man and a member of the ruling council. The convergence is not in the general idea of death. It is in the specific combination: condemned as a criminal, buried as a man of means. The honest note: the Hebrew in that line is difficult, and translations differ on how to render it. Scholars have argued over its precise sense for a very long time. The reading is defensible. It is not beyond discussion. Point 3. Suffering for others. This is the heart of it. Isaiah 53 does not simply describe a man who suffers. It describes suffering that accomplishes something for other people, pierced for their transgressions, carrying what was theirs. And this is precisely the claim the earliest Christians made about the crucifixion from the very beginning. Not that Jesus died tragically, that he died on behalf of others. The New Testament writers did not arrive at that framework gradually. They reached for Isaiah 53 almost immediately in some of the earliest Christian writing we possess. Why? Because a crucified Messiah was, on its face, a contradiction. Crucifixion meant defeat and disgrace. The claim required an interpretive framework in which suffering could mean something other than failure. Isaiah 53 was already that framework, already written, already copied, already in the hands of Jewish communities. It wasn't the Nalanik for Mount Mawan before any of it happened. And that is why the scroll changes the shape of the conversation. For centuries, the argument about Isaiah 53 could always be redirected into suspicion. Perhaps the text was altered. Perhaps Christians adjusted a word here, sharpened a phrase there, over the long medieval centuries where no one could check. That question is now closed, not by argument, by evidence, leather, ink, carbon, handwriting. The Dead Sea Scrolls did not give us a new Bible. They gave us something more useful, an ancient witness to how the Hebrew Bible was transmitted. A checkpoint, 1,000 years earlier than anything we had. So the question is no longer, could the text have been changed? The question is, what did the ancient text say, and what does it mean? That is a better question. It is harder, more interesting, and it can actually be investigated. Now step back and look at what had to happen for you to be able to ask it. A prophetic tradition takes shape in 8th century Jerusalem under Assyrian threat. The words are written, collected, edited, preserved through exile and return. Around 125 BC, a scribe in Judea copies the whole book onto 17 sheets of prepared skin. He rules his lines. He makes mistakes. He corrects them above the line. He has no idea anyone will ever look at his corrections. The scroll is used, read, handled until the leather thins near certain columns. It is placed in a jar. Rome tightens its grip on Judea. A child is born in a village in Galilee. 30 years later, he is executed outside Jerusalem, and his followers begin telling people that his death was not a defeat, and they explain it using words from a book that was already old. The revolt comes. Qumran burns. The jar stays sealed. Then time simply passes. The Roman Empire converts, splits, and falls. Islam rises. The Crusades come and go. The Masoretes copy Isaiah by hand in Tiberias. Printing is invented. Continents are mapped. 2 world wars are fought. Nobody knows the jar is there. Nobody is protecting it. There is no chain of guardians. That is precisely what makes it remarkable. The scroll survived not because it was watched over, but because it was forgotten, in the one climate on Earth dry enough to forget something safely. And then a stone thrown by a shepherd hits clay. So what does it mean to hold a text that was already ancient when Jesus lived? For a lot of people, Isaiah is difficult. It feels remote, old poetry, dense language, hard to place. Something read at Christmas and otherwise left alone. The manuscript changes that, not by adding a miracle, but by adding a body. Isaiah 53 stops being an abstraction floating somewhere in religious tradition and becomes a physical thing with a location, a date, a scribe, and a correction squeezed in above a line. Someone wrote these words. Someone copied them. Someone read them until the leather wore thin. Someone put them in a jar. The world changed completely, twice over. And when the jar was opened, Isaiah 53 was still there. If you made it this far, I'd like to know, what surprised you more, that Isaiah 53 survived at all, or what Isaiah 53 actually says? Leave it in the comments, and if this was worth your time, a like helps more than you'd think. The video on your screen now is the next investigation, another manuscript, another question that most people never think to ask. Go ahead and start it.